So it's usually when I do talks like this to people who are not as well informed as you are, the mouths go down, it gets dark. So I think it's symbolic that there's no light coming in. But you're more well informed than most people are that hear this. So this is something that you all are aware of, that without cure, there are no late effects. So we need to cure our patients before they can have late effects. Of course, we should cure them, like we say now, cure more, cure better, and that is something to aim for, but it is also difficult. The more we cure, a lot of the time it's more intense therapy that's given, and hence we have more possible late effects further on. So, please interrupt if you feel that there's something that's not clear and so on, just tell me. So this is the background. You can extrapolate to your own country. I mean, Sweden is a little over 10 million people. You see how many new cases we have. And like Kathy showed us yesterday, it's a fraction of the total burden of cancer that are children. Luckily, in many ways, it's like that. But it also makes it extremely difficult for us to do research because the numbers are few, and that's why we need to combine our efforts. We have the survival we have, and we have around or close to 500,000 of survivors in Europe. The way it is now, it's 450-something thousand in the US, I think. And they're quite young. The median age is around 30 years. So a lot of them are still young and have most of their lives ahead of them. So some more of the background, you can see that about a quarter of these have received treatment where we hopefully won't see a lot of late effects. Half of them have received treatment that has a significant risk of long-term complications requiring screening. And then there's the rest that already have some sort of late effect. Let's say they have a contact with an endocrinologist or a cardiologist for issues. And it's the treatment you got, the age you were when you got the treatment, and where in your body the disease was located that determines your risk. And we also fear, and I think we see that in our late effects clinics, that our survivors will get the same diseases as all the rest of us, but they will get it at an earlier age. They will get it more often, and they will get it in a worse way, that they will have more severe problems. So therefore, it's the correct follow-up, the right follow-up at the right time, which would lead us to find and hopefully treat and optimally also prevent late complications. And the goal is that every survivor should reach their maximum potential. It's not the same as they would have been able to, what they would have been able to become or potential they could reach without the disease and the treatment. But there is definitely, in my opinion, a maximum potential that we should strive for that will make their lives a lot easier if we can elevate them to that level. So the causes of the toxicity, we know radiotherapy, that the higher the dose and the larger the volume, and the younger the patient is, will increase the risk. Higher cumulative doses of chemotherapy usually brings a higher risk, but there are large inter-individual variations that we really don't understand fully now. To combine radiotherapy and chemotherapy often increases the risk of a late complication or an early one. Genetic predisposition, of course, plays a role. A surgery can give some consequences that are immediate, I mean, like an amputation or something like that. And for novel therapies, there is a lot of these things that we don't know. We know some TKIs will give cardiotoxicity, etc. We've seen for Gleevec and others for 20 years now. But many of these new novel therapies, we don't really know what to expect or what to predict that can happen later on. And the treatments and diseases that increase the risk the most, I would say, allogeneic bone marrow transplant. They deserve a follow-up which is not only directed like, unfortunately, a lot of the hematologists, at least in Sweden, do. They follow them for years and they take a blood sample every year and look at the blood counts. That's not what you should do if you're looking at the transplanted patients. Patients with CNS tumors, those treated with radiotherapy, and a lot of the sarcomas, especially the bone sarcomas, get intense treatments with high cumulative doses of different drugs. And then again, higher cumulative doses of certain chemotherapeutic drugs like cisplatin for the risk of ototoxicity or anthracyclines for the risk of cardiomyopathy. And relapse and refractory disease means that you add to what you already received the first time more treatment. And that's also true for when you give novel therapies. That's not given up front most of the time. It's given on top of everything else that they already received. So the history of this goes way back when in the 60s and especially the 70s, we started to treat children with cancer in a more efficient way. Very early on, there was, I think it was called the 5-center study to start with, which later became the Late Effects Study Group in North America. They started to show all these things early on, that given certain drugs, you run the risk of infertility. If you irradiate a growing individual, there will be hypoplasia in the area that you irradiate. And one way they found out was Wilms tumors. When Wilms tumors were given radiotherapy to half of the body, you irradiated half of the vertebrae, which meant that they grew like this. So that taught us if you want to irradiate a vertebra, you irradiate the entire vertebra. That means you will decrease the way you grow in height, but you will be symmetrical at least. And alkylating agents for the development of secondary leukemia, genetic predispositions that are listed here, and then also radiotherapy with increasing the risk for bone sarcoma and thyroid cancer were shown. And not least, endocrine and cognitive effects after irradiating the brain. It's not any organ. It's a sensitive part of your body, and you have an immense risk of late effects if you do treatment directed like that. And again, secondary cancers after Hodgkin's disease, the increased risk of breast cancer in women, but also, like I will show you later, in men. So the most severe late complications are a premature mortality. We call it late mortality, but it really is premature mortality. Late mortality is more than 5 years after diagnosis, but it is a premature mortality. Second, cancers, cardiovascular disease, lung disease, most often infections, endocrine disease, and the neurocognitive again. And Giulio D'Angio had a comment in Cancers already in 1975, and I think it's still relevant today, that cure is not enough. It has to be cure with the best possible quality of life, and we're not, even today, we're not giving that to a lot of our survivors. They will suffer from what we do to them. If we didn't do it, they would be dead, but they will suffer from the treatment. So this is a very seminal paper by Kevin Effinger and colleagues from the Childhood Cancer Survivor Study in North America. And what they showed in 2006, and which later was confirmed in a Dutch study a year later, was that 2/3 of the patients had at least one chronic condition, and in 1/4, it was a severe or life-threatening condition. And the relative risk compared to siblings was heavily increased. The cumulative incidence of chronic health conditions increased over time. And I think it still holds today that we don't see a plateau. with more time in follow-up, the more issues and problems we will see. So it's not that you come to a plateau and then you're safe, you're stable for the rest. So these are just some of the differences in relative risk between the survivors and their siblings. So you can see that the percentages are quite increased, and you see the relative risk being increased quite a lot. But it's also important to note that this is where how you confer the risk to the patient in a follow-up clinic. If the risk of something is very rare and treatment will double that risk, the outcome is still very rare. So we need to be able to convey how this risk is to the patient so that they don't think that everybody will have these issues, but your risk is increased compared to somebody else, but the risk may still be quite low. This is a study from the St. Jude Lifetime Cohort Study, which shows in their survivors that when you looked at, and I mean, they're sort of hoovering for late effects. You find everything. And then you come up to almost 100% will have some sort of a complication. That's not the same to say that all of them will be affected by it. But if you have enough chronic health conditions and you look for them, you will find a lot. I'm not sure everything that's in here is cancer-related, because it's often so that we try to see, it's cancer-related, but a lot of the time we also think that it's not cancer-related, that you had an outcome that you would have had even without the treatment. But what happens then is that older age, what we can see then is that older age diagnosis, earlier treatment era, and higher doses of brain and chest irradiation were significantly associated with more with the cumulative burden and intensity and severity of these chronic health conditions. But things are happening. We can see that the temporal pattern of risk of chronic health condition is going down. So it's, I'm going to see here. So it decreases over time, but what you need to see also, this is, okay, hang on, I get the laser pointer. This is the expected. So even if it decreases over time here, this is what is expected in the general population. So it gets better over time, but it's nowhere near where we would like to be. This is a study from the British Childhood Cancer Survivor Study showing that there was a reduction in the excess number of respiratory deaths among individuals diagnosed more recently, but it's still elevated compared to the general population. And this is a comparison of late mortality among survivors of childhood cancer between the United States and the United Kingdom. I think it's a misnomer that it's the United States. I think it's North America because it's CCSS, so it includes Canada. And you can see they suggest that you have more intense regimens to get into remission in North America, giving you better results in some instances, but in providing or giving more risk of late complications. As you can see here, this is all-cause mortality. You can see that the blue line is Britain, BCCSS. We have more deaths early on, but after many years, there are more deaths in North America because of the intensity of the treatment. And that's shown even more clearly here. This is respiratory disease, sorry. No, it's not, sorry. This is recurrence or progression. So you have more problems in Britain to start with because there was less intense treatment. For pretty much everything else, the red line, North America, exceeds the blue line in Britain, that the intensity-related mortality rates are higher in North America. This is just to show, which we were discussing earlier today, that for pretty much every organ, the more you irradiate, the higher doses you give, the higher the risk of a secondary cancer becomes, except for one, thyroid cancer. There is a dip here, after which the risk of cancer goes down because of cell death. You irradiate the thyroid to such an extent that the cells die. So dead cells can't give you cancer. You'll be hypothyroid. You need substitution for the rest of your life, but it's less likely that you will get a cancer over time. This is a study from the DCOG later in Holland, showing that if you give, or that there's an increased risk of solid tumors associated with anthracyclines and with alkylating agents, regardless if you've had radiotherapy or not. This is a study from Great Britain again, with the risk of cerebrovascular disease in almost 14,000 survivors of childhood cancer. And you can see here's the cumulative incidence in percentage over here. And you can see for the CNS tumors, if you go out with the attained age of 55, 60, 1 in 4 will have had a hospitalization for a cerebrovascular event. And because it's the same with everything you give radiotherapy to, tissues become stiff, like the lung, you get restrictive problems because of fibrosis and so on, and vessels and such of the heart or in the brain become stiff and give you bigger risks or greater risk of having a stroke or similar. This is another study led by Lieke Feijen in Holland, showing that we need to look at things and understand what the magnitude of risk is over time. So what Lieke and colleagues showed here is that we used to think that, for instance, mitoxantrone was 4 times more cardiotoxic than doxorubicin. But that was, if I understood it correctly, more related to myelotoxicity than to cardiotoxicity. And when Lieke and colleagues looked at this, they could show that mitoxantrone, which is used in AML, is 10.5 times more cardiotoxic. So if you give 10 milligrams of mitoxantrone, it's 105. So it adds a lot to the possibility of cardiotoxicity. And you need to add there's such a thing as doxorubicin equivalent dose. You need to recalculate all the anthracyclines and mitoxantrone in relation to doxorubicin, so you get the total cumulative dose, because that will trigger the follow-up that you need to do. Here is a study of hospital admission for neurological disorders in the Nordic countries, in the ALEX study. And you can see that even survivors of non-CNS childhood cancer are at high risk for neurological disorders. And also skeletal adverse events in the ALEX study. You can see patients in red compared to the controls, that for pretty much all of these incidents, it's difficult for you to read, but here we have all skeletal disorders, osteonecrosis, osteoporosis, fractures, osteochondropathies, and osteoarthritis down here. This is the largest study ever performed on late mortality. It's over 75,000 5-year survivors in the Pancreas Surfer Consortium that ran from 2011 to 2017. And you can see that over time, the cumulative mortality goes down. But at the end of follow-up in this study of 9,166 survivors, 9,166 survivors had died, which was 11.8% compared to what was expected, 927. So it's a standardized mortality ratio, meaning what you see in relation to what you expect, of almost 10, a factor of 10. And over time, even after you grow older, the all-cause mortality is still higher than expected for those that were 60 to 68 years of age. It goes down, but these are the more recent ones, but we still have an issue of increased mortality in our patients. And this is, like we said, the mother of knowledge is repetition. This is what was shown earlier, that what you die from most often in the beginning is the primary disease. Then second cancers, other known causes, and cardiovascular disease come up. More recently, it's been shown that the risk of digestive cancers is increased in this. And this is a large cohort of almost 70,000 5-year survivors in Europe. And you can see that the risk for any digestive cancer is 3.4 times that of the expected in all of these survivors. And you can see it goes all the way down to colorectal, colon only, rectum, etc. And there is an increased risk of this. And speaking about the Hodgkin patient that we had as a case today, and maybe even if you irradiated the neuroblastoma, if you have parts of the gut in the field of radiation, there is an increased risk of new tumors. And the most frequent primary malignancies here were Wilms tumor and Hodgkin's disease. Again, from Lieke in Holland, the increased risk of cardiac ischemia. So this is then not just cardiomyopathy, but cardiac ischemia in over 35,000 survivors. And 1 in 18 will, by the age of 60, develop a severe, life-threatening, or fatal cardiac ischemia. And here you can see that the percentage here is up to 10 here. Lymphoma is by far the most frequent one. Bone and soft tissue sarcoma and leukemia are here. So there is an increased risk for what ultimately is a factor for adding to the late mortality data, that you get an infarction, a cardiac problem. This is a recent study on male breast cancer. It is increased in the cohort here. In absolute numbers, they're very, very few, but you need to be aware that in males that have been irradiated to the breast gland as well, there is the risk. So they should know that if they have a lump or something in the breast, they should have it attended to. This is the Eritrea statement, which was revisited in 2016 and originally came from 2006, where a lot of people from both sides of the Atlantic met in a lovely place in Sicily, Eritrea, situated on a high mountain, fantastic place. And it was again stated that all these things that were essential to childhood cancer survivors were cure, care, communication of risk, etc., that you can all read here. So what do we do when we think we should do surveillance for these issues? We try to follow guidelines. And guidelines are needed in order to tailor and make the surveillance as effective as possible. And you need to know everything about treatment, because you can't go into a guideline and try to figure out what you're going to do to your patient unless you know everything about the treatment. You need to know cumulative doses. We need our radiotherapy friends to tell us what are the organs at risk, etc. So a lot has been done, and to say that it's here, the one by René Mulder and others in Lancet Oncology in 2013 and in JCO in 2020. Guidelines are living documents. You must revisit what you're giving for the recommendations when new data is acquired. The initial guideline for breast cancer screening said 20 grays and above to the breast gland. Then, almost immediately after the guideline was published, there was data saying that 10 grays or above is what can increase your risk. So therefore you need to start or include even more patients. One important thing which has been led by Ricardo Haupt in Geneva is getting together a survivorship passport which includes the treatment data, the surveillance recommendations that you are supposed to hopefully follow, which are dependent then on and which will provide, the patients and empower them to hopefully take responsibility for their own follow-up. The more you inform them, the better you inform them, the more likely they are to understand why we suggest these things. So interventions, I mean, we have all these studies showing that there are problems. We don't need more studies telling us that there are problems with the therapy we give. We need to turn it around and try to see, can we do something about it and to prevent it? So avoid or reduce exposure in the first place is, of course, something that would be very nice. But going back again to what was said about doxorubicin just now, if we take away doxorubicin, okay, what are we going to do instead? So we need to have a suitable substitution for that. Of course, we're not equal. In us, in our genome, there are things that make somebody can receive 400 milligrams per square meter of doxo and not have cardiotoxicity. Somebody else gets 250 and has a cardiomyopathy. So there are, of course, individual differences. And there's parallel prevention, like we were speaking about cardioxana, and then sodium thiosulfate to prevent ototoxicity. And secondary prevention is basically the screening, again, that you can screen. If you screen for breast cancer and you find it in time, then you can do something about it. The breast cancer screening recommendation now is if you've received 10 gray or more to the breast gland, you start at age 25 or at the earliest 8 years after therapy, whichever comes last, which is a lot earlier than you do for women in the general population. And you are able to catch things that you can do something about, which means that these women will not add to the statistics of late mortality. They will have a second cancer, yes, but they will not be included in the late mortality, hopefully. So this is a study on dexazoxane cardioprotection in osteosarcoma, which in my opinion showed that you could increase the doses, and with a relatively short follow-up, there was no added risk with giving dexazoxane to osteosarcoma patients. There are other studies showing pretty much the same thing. This is, I think, a very, very interesting publication that I hope. We haven't had a standard risk hepatoblastoma. We're a small center, so we haven't had a standard risk hepatoblastoma since this came out. I would be curious to know if those of you that have had them since this came out, if you have given sodium thiosulfate to these. Hepatoblastoma patients are really, they're small kids. They're really, really small kids. And you give them a hearing problem, they are handicapped for life with that in relation to how their life will be. So if we can do this and prevent the ototoxicity, I think it's a huge, huge thing. And with a follow-up of, I think, 3 years, they didn't see any differences in the outcome if you had sodium thiosulfate or not. So I would personally, if and when we get a standard risk hepatoblastoma, I will strongly suggest in our center that we give sodium thiosulfate. And I would hope that for neuroblastoma, high-risk neuroblastoma, there also receives cisplatin. And a lot of them are also quite small, not as small maybe as hepatoblastoma patients, but they're still small. That it would be, there's a case to be held, I think, for giving sodium thiosulfate. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lars, for this very interesting, excellent overview into a topic, I think, which is also important for those of us who are developing frontline trials, because I think we have lots of new options which may also help decreasing the risk of these late effects. We also recognized your declaration that you have not been influenced yet by Bob yesterday from his talk. So, any questions?
Actually, I think the audience, the youngers, maybe first, but let me kick off, and maybe then the ideas will come. So thank you very much for a very, very nice and very thorough overview. I always stop talking when I see those figures and think, okay, then we cure people, but then what then? And my question is, those earlier patients, we never checked for germline predisposition syndromes. So apparently they must be in there, because the more we learn, the more there are. And I think pediatric cancer must be also something with a predisposition. Do you think some of the patients with the intestinal cancers and etc., if we would take out patients with predisposition syndromes or breakage syndrome, etc., would we then already reduce the number of late effects there? What would your gut feel be?
I don't think I have a good answer to it, because it comes down to us learning more about this. We've started following the COG has a recommendation now, and I think that's regardless if you have a predisposition or not, that you start at age 30 or at the earliest 5 years after treatment if you have received radiotherapy to the colon. And we've started to do it in Lund, not following a recommendation, not following a guideline, but feeling that we can't do the same here as for breast cancer, that we just waited and waited and waited, and then we started to screen. And it's not scientific, it's not statistically proven or anything, but we have found cancers in young people. We found polyps, we found adenomas, and frank cancer in non-symptomatic patients.
Would you then go also to the clinical geneticists and ask if there might be some underlying genetic risk?
I think we should, and again, it comes down to what was spoken about yesterday. It comes down which tumor is it? Is there a family history, and so on, and then go from there. But of course, this is a joint venture. The whole thing is us together with clinical geneticists and others, making the puzzle more understandable.
Can I just, before ask something to the whole audience? First, thank you for this very important data and such a good overview, and I completely agree with the comment. But my first question is, in how many centers, or better said, countries, do you have systematic follow-up of childhood cancer survivors? Can you raise your hands? Whoa. Really systematic, so you really know what happened to your patient in 20 years? Wow.
And I do this every Wednesday. I see five people, anything from age 20 to age 60, 65. And it's so important. It's well worth doing. In many cases, it's fun, because it's people I treated in the 90s that I see again when they're 30, which is quite fun. but also you can see that it's an they're accumulating their problems. Somebody I saw 5 years ago at age 35 is now 45 years later and is starting to become more tired, not able to work full time. So we're pushing an iceberg in front of us when it comes to late effect, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering, do you have any comments or suggestions about how to counsel patients and manage chemo brain and the kind of those diffuse cognitive things that people can complain about? They're hard to measure and exactly quantify, but something I think patients talk about a lot.
I think it's extremely difficult to quantify it in a sense. I think we need to acknowledge that there is brain fatigue, that we have the people that are tired, and they look normal. They look like everyone else, but they're just tired in a different way than everybody else is after a day at work. And the experience we have, if we do a neuropsychological evaluation, is that it also increases over time, that we have more and more of them on social benefits. You can maybe work 75%, and then a couple of years later you work 50%, and then you work 25%. And it's a major issue. And I haven't got a solution for what to do. If someone else has, please tell us, because it is a big issue with chemo brain and this fatigue that is different from any other type of tiredness.
Reineke?
You were talking about the late effects of chemotherapy, radiotherapy, but in our working group we had a discussion about supportive care, like if you have a patient with already some loss in kidney function, should you make sure that you modify your supportive care to avoid any further deterioration? And is this a focus in pen care, for example? Because I think maybe we need some stronger guidelines on this as well.
In that case, I would think you see these problems up front in primary treatment. And then, of course, we do everything we can to avoid potentially nephrotoxic therapy. So we don't give vancomycin, we don't give aminoglycosides if we can avoid it. We don't give common amphotericin B, etc. What comes later on is that we try to advise the people, let's say they have one kidney after Wilms tumor, to at least tell their doctor that I have only one kidney. It should serve me well for the rest of my life most of the time, but don't give me something that's nephrotoxic. If we can choose between different drugs, don't give me the one that is potentially dangerous to my kidney.
Do we know much about the potential long-term effects of kind of more biological agents that we've been using, like rituximab, blinatumomab, effects on the immune system later in life?
No, I don't think we do. And it's important that there is a group called the Accelerate. I think several of you may have heard of the Accelerate, led by Gilles Vassal and Andy Pearson. And what we tried to do in that group is to see if we could figure out a clever way of monitoring late complications when you add novel therapies to this. We've been working on this since Lyon in 2019, I think it was. We have a suggestion now that's been very much done by our friends in Geneva, Ricardo Haupt and Monica Muraca, and that's out now in a couple of pharma companies to see if they agree and think that the system we have suggested is good. And then would be reporting complications when you add novel therapies. But again, it's going to be very difficult because they have previous therapies that absolutely contribute to their risk later on. But we need to follow them. We can't do what we've done in many other ways with late effects, do retrospective studies. It's laborious, it's expensive. You won't be able to find all the information on the treatment that was given. Let us do this prospectively, so we keep adding the information we get as we get it.
Perhaps may I ask also one question concerning interthecals and neurocognitive deficits. For many, many good reasons, we have skipped in almost all patients prophylactic and therapeutic cranial irradiation in the ALL patients, but we are incorporating more and more drugs which do not penetrate the CNS, like Eno, imatinib, Blina. So the number of interthecals will increase. Are you worried about also the chronic deficits that interthecals may cause?
It's not only interthecals, it's high-dose methotrexate and everything else we did to get rid of prophylactic cranial radiation that adds to it. I think it's maybe more subtle, but it's also a question of how you ask. If you ask the parents of a 7-year-old who finished his ALL treatment 2 years earlier, is everything fine? They say yes. But if you ask them, how is it? Then they will tell you things. And when they start school, then they will say that, oh, he's so tired. Everybody's complaining that he's not paying attention in school, etc. So you need to target how you follow these patients and how you investigate if they're having problems. And I'm sure that anything that's CNS directed carries a risk.
Thank you. One last question, Carmela.
Thank you very much, Lars, because this was really, really comprehensive. I think that the main problem you said already, that this is like moving an iceberg, is who is the interlocutor for these children or for these adolescents in the future? Because I was just a few weeks ago talking with one of our young, children, cured, and she was going to get married. She had osteonecrosis. She had the hip replaced. So the thing that she told me it was, I cannot believe that what cured me now is hurting me. So this is the real problem. Where are we putting these patients? In which hands? As a SIOP Europe, we have started discussing with the ESMO, for example, the European Society of Medical Oncology, because these patients, these people, let's say, I don't like the word survivors, because it's something that you survived some, nuclear bomb.
I know that you're a friend of Maasmechelen.
Yeah. But again, we are trying to build let's say, a path towards a better management of this patient. These patients need psychological protection from, also from the insurance companies. They don't want to insure them. They have problems in getting jobs. So this is a problem. 500,000 people cured, getting around in our countries is a huge number. So I think that this is something that locally has to be faced, but also at the more general European level. So we are trying to build something. PanCare is within SIOP Europe, is a great partner. So I think that in the next few years we can build something to bridge and to allow these patients, these people, to go towards a better life in the future.
A quick comment to that is that there is not one model for long-term follow-up that is the proposed one or the best one. Do the follow-up. If you do it with a primary care physician or an endocrinologist or a medical oncologist, or doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's that you do the follow-up.
Yeah.
You do it into adulthood, continue as long as it's necessary, and follow the guidelines.
Yeah.
Make sure that you are aware of the guidelines and you tailor your follow-up accordingly.
And the passport, I think, will
Passport
be
will
a
be
great
huge
tool.
help.
A great tool.
There's an EU project now called
Thank you.
PanCare Surpass, which Ricardo is leading together with Desiree in Germany. And